Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be doing an in-depth review of the Panasonic LUMIX S9. Wait, I'm reviewing a Panasonic? I'm pleased to announce the release of my Capture One and Lightroom presets, Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These are all available for purchase at my website. Go to kevindealphotography.com or check out a link in the description below. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. For all of you who visit this channel, welcome back. And for all of you who are here for your very first time, and it's highly likely in today's episode, welcome. I want to use this platform to ask for donations to BIG, which is an organization that helps intellectually disabled adults adapt to jobs in the real world. I also want to thank all of you who donate to my super thanks link. With those donations, I purchase more gear, which I can then review in episodes and help you with your buying decisions. But let's dive into today's episode. So if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you may be asking, Kevin, what in the hell are you doing reviewing a Panasonic camera? Great question. Well, I needed a dedicated video camera for this channel, something that I can use on a gimbal out in the field. I use my Canon R50 in the studio as my overhead camera. I use an R8 as my talking to the camera in the studio camera. And then my R5s and my GFX and my XH2 cameras are more out in the field photography stills cameras. So I wanted a dedicated video camera, and as a Fuji user, it certainly did make sense to consider the newly released XM5, but in typical Fuji fashion, they don't know how to launch a product without it taking 6 to 12 months to actually put your hands on one. And while I do have a plethora of lenses at my disposal, I was just like, I don't really feel like waiting around. I need something now. So this could be beneficial for those of you who are possibly looking to get this as your first Panasonic camera. I'm a Canon Fuji guy, and so I want to see what I like about those systems versus what I like about this system. It'll help me get more informed decisions about buying cameras moving forward. But I am going to actually let an expert who has plenty of Panasonic cameras but has never used the S9 have a stab at using this camera. I'm going to be taking this camera to Imaging USA in Dallas. I'm going to use this S9 as my workhorse. I'm going to check it out and see what I like and don't like about it, and I'm going to have him give his opinion as an expert who owns several Panasonic cameras as well. Something that is immediately standing out to me is the LUTS. I'll be putting the name of this LUT down below, and you're going to see very inconsistent color grading throughout this episode because I'm going to use the LUTs, I'm going to test the LUTs, and I want to see which LUTs I like. Additionally, it wouldn't be a proper review of a camera unless we shot stills. So yes, I am buying this camera for video, but I'm also going to review it for stills photography. I'm intrigued by the Leica LUT that's built in for stills photography. So I'm going to give this guy a proper review. Of course, we're going to be running this guy through his paces. We'll test out autofocus, tracking, and all that other fun stuff. But now that we've kind of got this whole episode starting out, let's talk about the specs. The Panasonic LUMIX S9 is a 24.2 megapixel full frame camera for the L-mount system. It features a BSI CMOS sensor with 5-axis in-body stabilization. It has an ISO range of 100 to 51,200 and can be extended from 50 to 204,800. The S9 is electronic shutter only and can shoot at shutter speeds up to 1/8,000th of a second in manual mode and 1/16,000th of a second in movie mode. It can shoot up to 30 frames per second in continuous shooting. The S9 does not have a viewfinder, but does feature a 3-inch 1.8 million dot free tilting touchscreen LCD. The S9 has a cold shoe, which makes it incompatible with hot shoe devices like speed lights, triggers, and XLR adapters. For video, the camera can do open gate at 4K and 6K up to 30 frames per second, and it can also do 4K 60 frames per second with a crop. The The S9 features a dedicated LUT button which allows you to utilize LUMIX or user-created LUTs to apply to video and stills. The S9 is compatible with the LUMIX Lab app, which allows you to integrate LUT, photo, and video synchronization between your camera and your smartphone. For ISO flexibility, the S9 features a dual native ISO of 640 and 4000. It utilizes a single UHS 2 card slot. It comes with a DMW BLK22 battery and charger. It has a battery life of 470 shots per charge. Its dimensions are 4.9 by 2.9 by 1.8 inches or 12.6 by 7.3 by 4.6 centimeters. With a battery inserted, it comes in at a weight of 1.1 pounds or 486 grams, and it comes in at a street price of $1,499 US. If you follow this channel, you know photography is my comfort zone. I am absolutely a photographer first and a videographer second. However, I purchased this camera specifically for video, and its very first job was to shoot the Imaging USA show in Dallas. I did a bunch of interviews with companies like Godox, Sigma, stopped by the Canon booth to check some things out. I did an interview with Fuji, and that's what led me to realize that the XM5 is way too small for video-only duties. It's just freaking tiny. Look at that thing. I found the S9 was super easy to get up and running with, although I didn't know everything. Thankfully, Panasonic had a booth there right next to B&H. I went by, they were super helpful, and they got all of my questions answered. It was an excellent experience, and as you can see right here, the image stabilization, the burnt-in LUTs, the color reproduction, I feel like overall, the S9 did a fantastic job of documenting this episode for my channel. I would say the feature that immediately stood out to me was the dual native ISO. On day one, we brought a light and we quickly realized we didn't need it because at 4000 ISO, you can shoot stop down, you can do interviews, and the shadows are super clean. This is very different than what I'm used to having to shoot in log on my Canon R5 at ISO 800. I always have to bring large, fast glass. You don't have to do that with the S9, and considering that this is a sub $1,500 camera, that dual native ISO is a standout feature. All the work was shot by my buddy Bill, who is a seasoned Panasonic user, and we'll get his opinions later on in the episode. He did a fantastic job of filming behind the scenes. We actually shot with an agency model in downtown Dallas when I was doing my review of the Viltrox 25mm 1.7, and it performed those duties admirably, but it was starting to get pretty cold, so I went down I-45 to Houston to try to escape the cold. I was unsuccessful. It was freezing when I got there, but it provided a pretty empty downtown for me to shoot a little bit of street photography. I also got booked to shoot a commercial video job, so we'll see how the S9 performed there. All right, so I'm here in downtown Houston to do one of my very first tests on this camera. I'm using the Dark Knight LUTs because throughout this episode, I do want to try out some of the LUTs, burn them into the footage, see how it looks in post-production, because it's kind of marketing itself as a camera where you're not supposed to edit, right? So let's see how well these LUTs do throughout the course of this video. But it's the coldest day of the year. I don't know why I chose to do my first test on the coldest day of the year. I'm here in town to do some fitness work for a model for an agency. I'm gonna use my S9 for that work. However, I have some time to kill, so I wanted to shoot some street photography because I am doing a full review of this camera. I'm doing a photography and a video review. And so we're gonna see how well this camera shoots street photography. I tend to always try out street photography first. It'll let me know if there's some habits about the camera that I don't like or some things that I do like. And I'm also gonna test it out for vlogging right now. Why not? So there we go. And one of the things that appealed to me about Panasonic LUMIX is everybody brags about how amazing or praises how amazing the image stabilization is. So look at this shot as I go in front of this cool Art Deco building right here. Tell me if you think the image stabilization looks good. I'm definitely gonna give you my opinions at the end of the video. While I shoot street photography, it's also gonna give me a chance to test out how ergonomic this camera is because I'm gonna shoot exclusively with these gloves on because it is freaking cold out here. It's windy out here, but I suffer for all of you. Hopefully some of you watching this episode will get something out of what I'm about to do because I'm certainly freezing my ass off for you. So I got in my fair share of street photography shots, and then I quickly called it a day because it was freaking cold. I went out the next morning and it was about 15-20 degrees warmer. The sun was out, and I'm glad that it was because it actually gave me two different scenarios in which I could test out that sensor. And I gotta say, I really like the way the colors reproduced in these still images that I'm showing you here right now. From an ergonomic standpoint, wearing the gloves in general did a pretty good job. However, when I was using the rear thumb dial, I definitely tripped over some things and almost formatted my card. So ergonomically speaking, it will work when you're wearing gloves, but just be a little bit careful, especially when you're using that rear dial. On to my next gig, I was booked to shoot some modeling portraits in a studio. Something to note about this camera is it does not have a hot shoe. So I use continuous lighting. I took the ISO up a little higher. I opened up that aperture a little more wide open, and I was pretty pleased with the results, but this is definitely something you're gonna have to contend with if you plan to use this camera for studio photography. So as you can see, I use the Leica monochrome. I love the characteristics of this profile, and I really like the way the color shots turned out as well. Moving on to the video portion, I shot some promotional material for a Pilates instruction class, and as you can see with these 60 frames per second sped up and slowed down clips, I think the S9 is absolutely a powerhouse in the budget category for professional level work. In terms of low light performance, that dual native ISO comes through once again in the clutch. These shots that you see right here, these fountains, were done at 60 frames per second. To be able to do that in such dark conditions and get pretty usable footage is impressive to me, and that's something you typically see in much more expensive cameras. I also used it indoors. I was testing out the minimum focusing distance here, testing out the bokeh. I thought that looked pretty pleasing at the bar. Moving on to stills, I went outside. I took a bunch of shots with the 50mm f1.8. I got the ISO upwards of 6400, and I thought that these shots looked pretty darn clean. To prove that point even further, check out how dark this shot is, and now look at how well it cleans up in post-production as I lift the blacks and lift the exposure. As far as tracking, as you can see right here, I was shooting these shots of this cowboy who was twirling around his rope. The first 40 shots of my sequence were successful, and then you can see that it drifted away for about 6 shots, then reacquired focus and locked on for the next 47. All in all, I'd say that's pretty acceptable. All right, so we're roughly at the halfway point of this review, and I want to talk about 5 changes I immediately made to the S9 to accommodate my style coming over from Canon and Fuji. The very first thing you should do if you get this camera is update the firmware. Mine did not ship with the latest firmware, and the update for it was enormous. Oftentimes, firmware updates fix little bugs here and there. This firmware update massively improved the camera. With the stock firmware, you have a 15-minute record time limit in 4K and a 10-minute record time limit in 6K. The newest firmware update adds a section where you can now go in and remove these limits. Even after the update, the limits are there by default, so make sure you actually go in and remove them. The new firmware update also adds more subject detection types and allows you to put in frame markers. Frame markers are important if you find yourself needing to shoot content that needs to be viewed both horizontally and vertically. You can see how your footage will look on something like an iPhone. It also comes in handy if you're shooting 6K open gate and you intend to take it down to 4K and you want to see how the footage is going to present in 16:9. So basically, if you haven't updated your firmware, pause this video and go update it right now. Next, I immediately had to change the front and rear command dial assignments because they were backwards from how I shoot Canon. So I assigned the front dial to shutter speed and the rear command dial to aperture. But the camera is customizable in that way, which is certainly welcome. The third thing I did is I reprogrammed the exposure compensation button to lock mode because I do everything in manual mode and don't use the exposure compensation button. The fourth thing I did was I changed continuous autofocus to always be in mode 2 because mode 1 only activates autofocus when you're recording. I want the camera to always be tracking the subject. And lastly, there's not much to hold on to without bringing in your second hand. Coming over from ergonomic Canon cameras that give you plenty to grab, this was a no-go for me. So I bought the small rig cage, which gives you a much better purchase on the camera. And if you're considering this camera for video or photography, I recommend that you immediately go out and buy a cage or grip of some kind for a better shooting experience. Now let's continue on with our tests of the S9. All right, we're gonna do our last test of this review for the Panasonic LUMIX S9, and we're gonna do my forte of portraiture. We're gonna do both photography and we're gonna do videography, and we're gonna test out that autofocus extensively. You're also taking a look at the dramatic blockbuster LUTs, so tell me what you think about that. Now let's get started. It's always easiest for me to test out the quality of an autofocus by doing portraiture because that's what I like to shoot. And as you can see right here, the Panasonic S9 did a fantastic job for both photography and videography. The more I shot with the autofocusing system, the more my confidence grew. Even when I thought I had missed a shot, I'd go back in later into post and discover that I actually nailed it. This is the opposite experience of what it's like to shoot on Fuji, where it tells you nailed the shot and then you go back in later only to find out that you missed. I also used this opportunity to test out the photography LUTs, and to no surprise, they were just as good as the video LUTs. But the standout LUT to me was definitely the Leica monochrome. It's now my favorite monochrome preset. I love it so much, in fact, that I'm gonna develop a preset in Capture One that I can apply to my Canon and Fuji files. It's absolutely that good. And while I still favor Fuji Color Science overall for color photography, I think LUMIX monochrome science is superior to Fuji. But I want to get an expert's opinion about how he feels about the Panasonic S9, so let's kick it over to my friend Bill. Bill has been assisting me at the Imaging USA show, and he's a seasoned Panasonic user, but this is his first time using the S9. So what are your impressions using the S9 as a seasoned Panasonic user?
I love it. I mean, it's really streamlined. I mean, the fact that it's full frame and such a compact body is amazing. And you know what? It's been reliable. Every interview we've recorded, it hasn't hiccuped. It maintains focus. You can see the focus box right on you the entire time. I'm looking at that right now. I know, you don't have a viewfinder, so you can't always, see exactly what it's doing. Having that box on you for the autofocus and everything tells me it's doing a pretty good job of tracking you and keeping autofocus. Overheating, not an issue, and I understand in the latest firmware too, it got rid of the record limit too, so I think if you're recording standard frame rates, we've been doing 29.97, it's been flawless as far as I can tell. The color looks great compared to all the other Panasonics. So far, I'm impressed with this little machine, and this lens is really sharp. I mean, this is a great little lens right here. You can put your filters on it for outside, variable NDs, and it's just a really compact package for a gimbal work. I mean, this is top notch.
Okay, so you just heard the opinions of Bill, who is a seasoned Panasonic LUMIX user. I feel like his opinions on the S9 are very important for this review. But now we're gonna go back to my studio and you're gonna hear my opinions, someone who is just getting into the Panasonic LUMIX ecosystem. I'm gonna tell you if I'm gonna keep this S9 or if I'm going to return it. So overall, I've enjoyed my experience with the S9. But first, let's talk about some things I wish they got a little better. For a video-centric camera, I was disappointed to see the absence of a full-size HDMI port. Smaller HDMI ports are less robust and more prone to breaking under sudden force. Since they're often connected directly to the motherboard, repairing them can be as costly as replacing the camera itself. When it comes to photography, the S9 probably is my least favorite camera that I own, mainly because it lacks a viewfinder. In bright and outdoor conditions, it's difficult to accurately see my composition and exposure, both while shooting and reviewing images. I often have to find shade just to check my work, which isn't ideal for my workflow. And even then, I have a hard time noticing small things up the camera, like subtle banding from the electronic shutter. While it's cool that Panasonic does have a built-in tool to combat banding, if you're not actually seeing the banding occur in real time because the screen isn't bright enough, that makes using the camera a more frustrating experience. That said, I own some of the best photography cameras on the market designed for a much more professional audience than the S9. So, if you're watching this and wondering whether this camera is bad for photography, take my criticism with a grain of salt. If you handed me this camera for a project and said, make it work, I absolutely could. So while the lack of viewfinder is a downside for me, it still does take great photos. Plenty of photographers prefer using the rear screen, and even I use it in certain situations. But when you need a viewfinder, you need a viewfinder, and there were many times while shooting outdoors that I instinctively raised the camera to my eye, only to look like an idiot when I realized and remembered it wasn't actually there. That brings me to a related point. This camera is electronic shutter only. In modern LEED certified architecture, LED lighting is almost exclusively used, significantly increasing the chances of banding. While walking around the Arlington Convention Center in Arlington, Texas, I found this to be particularly frustrating. I didn't notice the banding until I put the images on my laptop. Because the S9 is electronic shutter only, you will get warping with laterally moving objects that are going fast, as you can see right here. The simple addition of a mechanical shutter could have eliminated that issue. There's also no hot shoe, only a cold shoe, with no electronic contacts. This means you can't use a flash or trigger system, making it unsuitable for many professional photographers. Videographers also lose out, as the lack of a hot shoe means no compatibility with devices like the Panasonic DMW XLR2 or XLR1 or future third-party accessories. Staying on the subject of audio, there's no headphone out on this camera. I understand that real estate is at a premium on this camera, but a 3.5mm connection is one of the smallest connections in our industry. I'm having a hard time believing the engineers at Panasonic simply couldn't find a way to include a place to put a headphone jack on the side so we could all monitor the quality of our audio. For a video-first camera, having the cables exit on the grip side is a major design flaw. With HDMI cables sticking out the right side where you need to grip the camera, handheld shooting becomes awkward and uncomfortable. Thankfully, this didn't affect my gimbal work, because if it had, I would have outright returned the camera. Another reason to consider the small rig cage is the build quality on the body doesn't feel particularly robust. I won't put this to the test, but it seems like if it fell onto my driveway, multiple pieces would break apart. In contrast, I've actually had Canon cameras survive similar drops with no issues. I get that Panasonic likely made this decision to keep the weight down, but durability is a concern. Another major drawback is no weather sealing. Personally, I think any camera over $1,000 should have weather sealing, period. And for street photographers drawn to the S9 for its compact size, and also landscape photographers, this is something to consider. That being said, I've used this camera in a light drizzle and it was just fine. I've never actually had a non-weather sealed camera fail on me before in adverse conditions, but going that extra step to make it weather sealed would have been a nice added touch. That may have sounded like a long list of cons, but with so many features in today's cameras, pros and cons lists tend to be extensive. Now let's dive into the great features that ultimately won me over with the S9. 6K open gate. It offers unmatched flexibility in post-production. Getting this feature in a camera at this price point is pretty rare. While I shoot in 6K oversampled with both my Canon and Fuji cameras, those crop the footage in camera. With 6K open gate, I have complete control over the crop and post, and it uses my entire sensor. This gives me the freedom to adjust composition when things don't go perfectly on set or if a client requests a change later. Having that choice in post-production is invaluable. The dual native ISO is one of the biggest standout features. During my first major project with this camera at Imaging USA, I used it on a gimbal at ISO 4000 with my 20-60 lens at f6.4 indoors. The results were fantastic. What stands out the most about dual native ISO is that you don't need expensive f1.4 lenses for shooting in less than ideal light. Your kit lens can handle it because the sensor does the heavy lifting, all while maintaining clean shadows. This also translated well for photography. This means you don't have to invest in larger, pricier glass to get good performance, and you don't have to have perfect lighting, which can save you money when entering into the Panasonic system compared to other brands. Which brings me to my next point. It also makes the lack of hot shoe a little less of an issue because you have to use continuous light with this camera in a studio environment, and being able to get clean shadows at ISO 4000 means your shutter speed can be bumped up to a reasonable setting to freeze motion and limit motion blur. Now to another really large pro, image quality. The image quality for both photography and videography is incredible, especially for video. I'm so blown away by the stunning video files this camera produces that I'm completely switching my entire YouTube channel from Canon to Panasonic. For video, not for stills. Fuji and Canon still went out there. But it's really that good. And I was able to test out the 20-60, the 51.8, and the 85 1.8 for this review, and all three lenses were fantastic. A small but significant feature for filmmakers is the ability to lock the shutter angle at 180 degrees. This ensures that your motion blur remains consistent even if you have to change frame rates, something you don't even get on $3,000 or $4,000 from companies like Canon. Another pro, image stabilization. On the S9, the image stabilization, whether I was on a gimbal, handheld, I turned on Boost IS and I just wanted to stand there like a tripod. In all those cases, the image stabilization lived up to the hype. Another pro of this camera is the LUTS. Aside from demonstrating its log abilities, all the footage in this episode shot on my S9 was done with the LUTS applied in camera. With the help of zebras and the waveform monitor, which you can actually conveniently drag wherever you want to on the screen, this camera gives me the confidence to shoot with LUTS applied, which is exactly the type of workflow I hoped this camera would provide. Their marketing portrays the S9 as a simple system where you shoot and share. They intentionally crossed out the word edit because it's being marketed as a camera that has such good looks out of the camera that editing really isn't necessary, and this may be one of the biggest pros of the camera. Being able to use the built-in LUTs or import them from the LUMIX Lab app has saved me a significant amount of time in post-production. While I enjoy tweaking color on RAW files as a photographer, I don't particularly enjoy video color grading. The ability to bake in LUTs was one of the key features that attracted me to this camera in the first place. Less work for me means more time for other tasks, and I can turn my videos around faster for all of you. But if you are the color grading type, no worries, the S9 can still shoot in log as well, but I'm telling you, the more I use their LUTs, the less I find myself wanting to shoot in log. Coming from Fuji, I find Panasonic's approach to using both official and community LUTs much more streamlined. The ability to transfer LUTs directly from your phone to your camera and store nearly 40 presets is definitely something Fuji could learn from. When it comes to app integration and user-generated presets, I feel like Panasonic sets the standard. And then for those of you who are wondering how easy this is to use, that's another pro. As a Canon and Fuji user who hadn't used LUMIX cameras in about 4 years, I was pleasantly surprised by how quickly I got up and running with the S9. My previous experience with LUMIX menus was a nightmare. I struggled to find my way around and found the layout pretty confusing. I'm not exaggerating when I say I had my custom shooting modes programmed within a few hours, and by day 2, I had everything dialed in to the point where it integrated seamlessly into this YouTube channel. And now on to autofocus, which I'm also going to put under the pros. LUMIX has dramatically improved its autofocusing system, and the S9 benefits from phase detect autofocus. This makes a noticeable difference compared to older LUMIX models, offering a more reliable subject tracking for both photo and video shooting. I used to not even consider Panasonic cameras because they were so far behind the competition in terms of autofocus. However, this autofocus tracks better than my Fuji cameras, and while it's still behind Canon and Sony, it's much closer than it used to be and is definitely acceptable for 2025. The more I use this autofocus, the more confident I become. And now to probably the biggest pro of this camera, value. Value is a major win with the S9. For a little less than $1,500, you're getting a video-first camera with 6K open gate, cinema-centric features like proper anamorphic support, and more. On top of that, they threw in a 20-60 lens, a $500 value, and during a promotion, they also threw in a 50mm 1.8 lens, a $450 value. So I got like $950 worth of free lenses with my $1,500 camera. Considering all these features, the S9 is an undeniable value. It's also likely those prices that I just rattled off will actually be a little lower in reality, as Panasonic regularly runs promos. As a matter of fact, I mentioned that I got a free 51.8. Well, that was last month. In the month that I am recording this review, they are throwing in an 85mm 1.8. So check the LUMIX website for promos if you're watching this video and seriously considering pulling the trigger on an S9 body. Here's my summary of the S9. If you're a photographer first, I'd recommend avoiding this camera. It's clearly not designed with photography as the main focus. The lack of a viewfinder, weather sealing, and a mechanical shutter are significant drawbacks for those of you who need to work in bright, challenging, or fast-moving conditions. Without these features, there are better options available. If you want to stick with LUMIX, consider stepping up to the S5 II. But for a photography-first camera, there's not much that makes this or any Panasonic full-frame camera stand apart from Canon, Nikon, Sony, or Fuji. It's only once you add the video features that this conversation starts to become more debatable. And don't forget about that lack of hot shoe. If you're after a compact, lightweight camera packed with video features typically found in higher-end cinema models, offers reliable tracking, and autofocus, produces stunning color, and has a sensor that allows you to build a kit with darker lenses, thus saving you money in the process, then you should take a hard look at the Panasonic LUMIX S9. I bought this camera knowing its limitations for photography, but I wanted to test them out and give the entire camera a proper review. I purchased it for video, intending to use it on my gimbal. For that purpose, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better camera at this price point. I was so impressed with its video performance that I replaced my Canon EOS R8 for this static shot you see right here. In fact, I bought a second S9, which I'm using to record myself right now. With that, my YouTube channel is now fully switched from Canon to Panasonic for video duties. I'd say that's a pretty strong endorsement. That does it for today's episode. Do you think my review of this S9 was fair? Do you think my pros and cons were fair? Tell me about it in the comments below. Are there pros and cons I didn't mention? Tell me about those in the comments below. Did you look at this and go with another camera instead? Tell everybody why in the comments below. And if you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.